Hello everyone, this is Lydia Bryseth, the manager of Colorin, Colorado, and I'm so happy to be here today with Sarah C.K. Moore from the Center for Applied Linguistics. Sarah, thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about a lot of different ways that mainstream teachers can help ELLs in the classroom, whether it's a classroom setting for elementary school, content area teachers, older grades, a whole variety of topics that we're going to be including today. Before we get started, I do want to take a moment to thank our partner, the National Education Association, for their support of our Facebook Live series, as well as our longtime partner, the American Federation of Teachers, who has made so much of the great content that you know and love possible on Colorin, Colorado. So thank you to the NEA and the AFT. We look forward to hearing everybody's questions and comments. Feel free to like and share this post. And we are going to jump in with Sarah right away. So first, Sarah, if you could just tell us about Center for Applied Linguistics, what the organization is and what your role is there.
Sure. Well, CAL was founded through a grant that was given to professors at Georgetown from the Ford Foundation in 1959. And what we strive to do involves essentially helping teachers and other educators, linguists, other stakeholders in the field of language minority schooling, refugee integration. We've done a lot of work with adult ESL. So what we try to do is help practitioners and other sort of on-the-ground stakeholders, and also those sort of at middle levels, understand kind of complex research and theory and what that really means. So it's applied linguistics. So how do we sort of how do we make sense of implications around language and the role and function that language plays in society, pertaining to various entities, including, for example, schools. So at Cal, I am Program Director of Pre-K-12 English Learner Education. And what that means is we conduct research around sort of best practices for supporting the needs of ELLs, English learners, emergent bilingual students, language minority students. And my background has also involved policy, because when we talk about sort of research and theory, we also want to address issues in policy. And when we're talking about policy for language minority students, mostly what we're getting at is ensuring equity and access. And so that means that we want to make sure that kids are provided with the necessary supports so that they are able to access core content as well as language development. And when we talk about language development, we mean not only in English, but also native language maintenance.
And you do this through a variety of ways, if I'm not mistaken: books, reports, professional development training, and also one of the projects you've been involved with, which is the Education Connection social network. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Education Connections is a large sort of initiative that consists of 3 projects. 2 are funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and a third is made possible through a grant as part of the Investing in Innovation Fund, which is within the Office of Investment and Innovation and Improvement, which is overseen by the U.S. Department of Education. And so these are related projects, part of, again, this larger initiative. And for them, we provide largely online and virtual, although not entirely. We also do face-to-face professional development and other sort of support services. Professional development, access to resources. We are a fairly large network of educators across grade levels, where mostly our participating teachers are in the United States, but also around the world. We also have a couple folks who are working in higher education as well as pre-K-12. So what we're hoping is to convene educators in such a way that we are able to leverage their shared capital and expertise around promoting access to language and content for English learners through primarily sheltered instructional methods, but that does not preclude certainly dual language settings as well as other varied educational settings for English learners. So.
Great. And we will put a link up to the Education Connections portal. It's a free online registration, and once you join, you can post questions and comments. I believe there are special tips that come out at least on Friday, maybe on Tuesday, if I'm remembering that correctly, as well. People can put their own questions and ideas, and it's not just, you know, ESL specialists or ESL specialists. It's people from a wide variety of backgrounds, and it's really become a nice online community of people that can help. So that's definitely a great resource to check out. So let's just take a big picture view for a little minute of ELL education right now. Where are the demographics changing? What's happening right now with ELLs across the country?
Sure. So as we know, as we would expect, there are states in the country where English learners have a long-standing presence, significant, substantial populations of English learners. California and the Southwest, for example. We have significant new growth in areas of the southeastern United States. Here we're seeing major upticks. 400%, 500-600% increases in English learners. And so these are the places where we really want to get at mainstream teachers who may have had limited prior exposure to sheltered instructional methods. In some cases, these are also low incidence counties or districts. What that means is you may only have a couple of English learners. And so what we hope to convey to districts and schools is the need for really prioritizing, even though there aren't a whole lot of kids who may need language supports, that they are there, and also recognizing the populations, if there is a significant uptick, that the responsiveness. Most English learners in the United States are native Spanish speakers. Many of whom are born in the United States. Notably, however, there are 5 states in the country where Spanish is not the language most spoken. These are statistics that have come out from the Migration Policy Institute, which has done a lot of work in looking at sort of the field and the state of English language learner demographics and dual language learner issues. For example, in Vermont and Maine, the languages most spoken are spoken by refugees. And then in Hawaii and Alaska, the most spoken languages are indigenous languages. So, we talk about making sure that we're not thinking of English learners as a monolithic sort of this kid. These kids are very, very different across regions, across states, across districts. And so it's important that we're able to understand where each child is coming from and sort of pursue knowledge of kids' families and their backgrounds linguistically, as well as in terms of their prior education and levels of literacy, and sort of acknowledging and celebrating the resources that these kids are bringing into our schools.
And this speaks to the importance of getting to know students, getting to know their families as kind of a first step. If you are perhaps never worked with English language learners before and you don't know where to start, I think starting with the student and what do I know about that student? What can I learn? What are some steps that teachers can take to get to know more about their students or get to know them personally and get to know their families, particularly if there is a language barrier there?
Right. Well, first and foremost, interpretation services. are available in all districts. And so teachers should sort of be aware of that and take advantage of those. We can send letters home that are in parents' native languages. We should, however, think about, again, sort of levels of literacy, and so we should provide also opportunities for interaction that don't necessarily rely on literacy. It's important to invite parents and family members into the school. That may be a home visit. In terms of once we have a sense of where our students are coming from, ways that we can sort of establish connections between home and school. For example, I have a bilingual library, and kids can sort of check out books and bring those home. So I'm lending books to bring home to read with family members, siblings, others. So I think this depends partly on where you are, what resources are available to you in your school. A first step certainly is connecting for mainstream teachers, connecting with the ESOL or ESL or dual language expert who's available in the school, or if it's, again, low incidence, it may be an itinerant teacher. But it's first getting recommendations from that person and getting a sense from them if they have sort of knowledge of background. And then, it's identifying where are sort of consistent opportunities for interacting with kids' families.
That's great. Thank you. And I just want to take a moment to say I'm Lydia Bryseth, manager of Colorin, Colorado, here with Sarah C.K. Moore from the Center for Applied Linguistics, and we're talking about ways that mainstream teachers can support ELLs. To build on what you were saying, I think it sounds cliche to say think outside the box, but a lot of times what proves to be effective with ELLs looks a little bit different because perhaps they're coming from a different culture, perhaps there's a different expectation from the home country of the role that parents play in the school. I remember being in a presentation where someone said, someone at a Mexican school said our expectation was that the parents dropped the children off on time, and that was really almost the last we wanted to see of them. There was also I remember there was some kind of checklist that had to do with it was a grade or it was an evaluation of students, maybe not exactly hygiene, but appearance and how carefully the hair was combed. And so there may be other ways that the parents are investing a lot in their children's education, let alone the fact that they've perhaps come from another country to offer better opportunities, right? And so looking beyond are they there for the 3 p.m. parent-teacher conference? Are they there at the PTA meeting, which is sort of maybe the standard that we're used to, is really important to making some of those connections, right? And sort of thinking where to go. In terms of teacher preparation, what do we know about how prepared teachers are to work with English language learners?
Sure. Well, not all states require that pre-service teachers complete significant preparation in the area of sheltered instructional methods, or ESL or ESOL, whatever the state is calling this particular preparation. So that's one piece. There are a handful of states that do require that when they complete college, students have completed preparation coursework. Often, English learners will be sort of part of a course on, for example, multicultural education. But rarely is there an entire course that teachers have to take on ESL methods or sheltered instructional methods. And those are states where we've seen who have long-term English learners, which is not to say long-term English learners in terms of that sort of classification of student, but populations who have been in the schools for many, many years. So that's a piece of what we want to think about. Beyond that, in terms of in-service preparation, we have a study, and there have not been very many. We have a study that was a survey conducted in the state of California that found that only 12.5% of teachers had professional development in the area of ESL in the previous 8 years, significant professional development in the area of ESL. And so this is certainly something that needs to be addressed in the field. I don't know the best way to do that. I think certainly at the state level would help. There are federal recommendations in the Every Student Succeeds Act, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, but these requirements are codified really at the state level. And so a lot of it depends on sort of the context and the populations and the perspective of the state and the state education agency.
Right, and that also speaks to why it's so varied from state to state, and why you potentially could have one set of requirements in one state and then move to teach in another state and then have a totally different situation, as well as your interaction with the state university system and how the other credentialing bodies are working in terms of the preparation. So overall, there are a lot of English language learners, and there are very few teachers who have been prepared to work with them, is essentially the takeaway, which is why it's so important to have the resources available through Cal, through Colorin, Colorado, because it's really a first line of defense of teachers who were finding these kids in their room and maybe feeling very unprepared and wanting to do a good job, but just not knowing where to start. So I think that that's a good way to bring up this question of what do we know about the research and what is it telling us about language instruction in the United States for our context?
Before I talk about several sources of reliable research in the field, I'll just also say that mainstream teachers employing and implementing sheltered instructional methods, that needs to be regarded as separate from the ESL supports that kids need. So what we don't want to do is conflate professional development in the area of ESL or ESOL or English learners, or however we want to talk about that, with ESL expertise. So these kids still need another expert in the room. Professional development is not a substitute for a degree in ESOL or the expertise of the English language learner expert on staff or in the building. So just to be clear on that, we're not presuming that professional development makes up for that other sort of very specialized expertise. So that being said, what is that specialized expertise? What do those folks know? What do those ESL teachers know? So one piece that I'll reference is promoting the educational success of children and youth learning English, promising futures. This is a meta-analysis publication, February 2017. This is results from convenings of experts in the field of language minority schooling, published by the National Academies. 2 members on the expert committee happen to also be on Cal's board, Jean Garcia and Fred Genesee. And so I think you'll link to findings from this very large-scale meta-analysis of what we know about English learners. What are the demographics? What are the needs? There's a chapter just on early childhood, dual language learners, we might call those kids. So I would strongly sort of recommend that the field look to this as a guidebook for where we are, where we're going, and what our best practices, what has research shown are best practices. This is very comprehensive and about the overall field. An example of particular specific practical examples, sort of bigger picture, not down to the level of a strategy, is a practice guide published by the Institute of Education Sciences. This is a 2014 publication These folks reviewed research that's been done regarding supporting the needs of English language learners. The studies reviewed are only those that stand up to the What Works Clearinghouse standards, which are the research standards established by the Institute of Education Sciences and the U.S. Department of Education. And the authors of this report provide us with 4 recommendations. And I'll read those just so that I get them right verbatim.
Of course.
Teach a set of academic vocabulary words intensively across several days using a variety of instructional activities is recommendation 1. Recommendation 2 is integrate oral and written English language instruction into content area teaching. And so that's part of what we're talking about here, mainstream teachers. Provide regular, structured opportunities to develop written language skills. That's recommendation number 3. And recommendation number 4, provide small group instructional intervention to students struggling in areas of literacy and English language development. And so these 2 together comprise, I think, a nice starting point. For folks who want to get right down and start implementing right away, the Literacy Guide. For those who are interested in much more comprehensive look at the state of the field, the report by the National Academies from February of this year.
And the second publication, which has the 4 areas that you just shared, includes a number of strategies, practical examples from the classroom, and so as you get into, you can see what does this look like, and there's a sort of an in-depth section about each recommendation, exactly, and so we'll link to that as well from our resource page, because I think it uses very accessible language and examples, if I'm not mistaken, from different subject areas, so that teachers can hopefully find an example in their area of discipline to see what does this look like in my area, my field, my age group, where there might be some variation. Okay, that's great. And in terms of discussions around the use of the native language, how the native language is being supported in classrooms, there's been a lot of debate and discussion for a long time. You have looked in particular at this story in Arizona through your own research, and can you just tell us, what do we know currently about the role of the native language of a student in the classroom?
Sure. Well, this can be a tough one because it verges into discussions of politics and ideology, and so there's research and theory, and then there's politics and ideology. Based on research and theory, what we know is that students who are proficient in their native language learn a second language more quickly and fare better. In terms of educational outcomes, not only linguistically related, but also on content area assessments, among a range of other factors. So, we've established many years ago that, in fact, bilingualism and multilingualism has many cognitive benefits. So there's no question that when at all possible, we want to maintain kids' native languages and promote bilingualism and multilingualism when that's appropriate, which is to say kids are speaking more than 2 languages. What I will point out is the role that Cal has played and is playing in the sort of somewhat recent past, which is to say 15 years ago and now. We will be publishing next month, November 2017, a 3rd edition of Guiding Principles for Dual Language Instruction. This, we hope, will serve, and my understanding is has served, although this is not my particular area of expertise, as a guidebook or handbook for program development and maintenance and sort of best practices around dual language programs and practices.
That's exciting because a lot of communities are exploring dual language in lots of different places around the country for lots of different languages, not just for Spanish. Sometimes there might be a big immigrant community, or sometimes there's demand from other families. And I know there's some sort of also political considerations based on who are the families who are asking for the program, who are the families who are involved. But overall, we've definitely seen an uptick in the number of dual language programs, whether, there are a number of different program models and how there's a lot of diversity in that, but overall, we know that there is an increased interest overall. So this seems like a good time to get some guidance on that topic, right?
Right, yes. And we also are celebrating, of course, the passage of Proposition 58 in California, which supports dual language programs, which previously had not been supported. So we're excited about that.
Could you tell us a little bit about your work on Arizona and what you've learned, and as well as the book that you edited?
Sure. I edited a book about, there are a series of case studies, the implementation of structured English immersion as the alternative to dual language or bilingual instructional program models for teaching emergent bilingual English learner language minority students. California was the first state to outlaw bilingual education. Arizona was the second. And as the program model primarily used for the instruction of emergent bilingual students. And so what we've done in this book is we have sort of done a deep dive into what does this look like? What do structured English immersion or English immersion programs look like for kids in classrooms, for teachers, for administrators and principals? And what we find is that the needs are not well supported, and that kids quickly fall well behind their monolingual native English speaking peers. This is an unfortunate state of affairs for emergent bilingual students in Arizona. But fortunately, we hope that sort of there's some shifting that we've seen thanks to Proposition 58, again in California, and that maybe some of that will come over. We can always have wishful thinking.
Well, it's a good time also to mention the Seal of Biliteracy, which is a great initiative that came out of California,
right?
As a way of it's literally a seal on the diploma, right? That high school students can get, verifying that they are bilingual through which they have proven through language exams and really rigorous academic activity, and it started kind of at a district grassroots level and then built up to a state level, and now I don't know the number of states, but a number of states have adopted it. A number of districts have adopted it even if their state hasn't. And so and the great thing is there's no rule about which language, if it's your own home language as an immigrant student or whatever it is, and I know some states are also highlighting their own indigenous languages as well, and so these kinds of initiatives are sort of changing the narrative and turning the tide a little bit, I think, which is helpful and tangible and an easy way to latch on, because it's such a complicated topic that, as you said, gets lost in the politics and the weeds of the research a little bit.
Yeah, I think that, part of what we're seeing with the seal and why it's so important is it's a practical message with regard to your language and maintenance of literacy in your native language is valuable, and we appreciate it, and it will leverage you in your future. As a participating member of society and the economy and otherwise. So we're moving beyond just saying this with the seal. The seal sort of further codifies, if you will, that biliteracy is inherently valued and plays a positive role in the future.
That's great. I'll take a moment again to introduce ourselves. I'm Lydia Briceth, the manager of Colorin, Colorado, here with Sarah C.K. Moore from the Center for Applied Linguistics. And one thing, I was talking with one of our project advisors, and she asked if in the course of our conversation, if we could highlight some of the specific ways in which teachers could build language development and reading comprehension support. So I think this kind of is a nice introduction into the some of the more specific strategies and ideas for the classroom that you wanted to introduce in terms of what you've been focusing on in Cal.
Right. So for Education Connections, when we started these projects, we asked ourselves, okay, well, we're promoting sheltered instruction. What is that? There are all kinds of different approaches to defining what is sheltered instruction. And we wanted to be specific without being prescriptive. And so what we came up with were 4 strands that we talked about, that our approach to sheltered instruction is embodied by these 4 strands. And the first of the 4 is define. And so when we operationalize define, we're encouraging teachers to develop and share with students and regularly refer to not only content objectives, which often derive from the college and career readiness standards, but also language objectives. And so here, what we're hoping to do, not only for students, but also educators and teachers, is to sort of flesh out and break down and explicitly identify the hidden language demands in instruction, curriculum, various activities that may involve an instructional expectation. So to what extent do I presume that this student understands or can share in English this core content concept? So it may be that a student understands a core content concept. It's just the challenge is how to convey that. And so here's where we invite teachers to write not only content objectives, but take a close look at what is the activity that I'm asking students to be involved with, and what language demands in terms of specifically reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And so we want, in each language objective, we want to say which of the 4 language domains students will need to use in order to accomplish the content objective. And we want these to be action-oriented. They need to be understandable by the kids. And again, we want to refer back to them frequently throughout the lesson, obviously at the beginning, but also throughout. And obviously, the language demand comes from the strategy or lesson that is being employed in order to accomplish the content objective. So it derives from the language embedded in the content objective activity.
And could you provide an example for maybe a content area lesson of what a language objective and what a content objective would look like?
Sure. Students will be able to read about the various regions in the state of Virginia, which is where we are. And that may be a language objective that derives from students will be able to recognize the different regions in the state of Virginia. And so in order for the student to be able to recognize, they must read. We might have then a related language objective that is students will be able to list the various regions in the state of Virginia. And so it's just sort of teasing out and breaking down what language production and reception will be necessary in order to address the content objective.
And I should tell our audience, we have an article which is our most popular article on Colorin, Colorado, written by one of Sarah's colleagues, Jennifer Himmel at Center for Applied Linguistics, about writing language objectives in content area classes. So we will be sure to share that and post that as part of our archive resources, but it's clearly an area where people really want information and guidance and examples and ideas, and it's by far and away our most popular article every single year. So I think there's a lot more to explore with that, and once people kind of get the hang of it, then you start noticing here's where some language is embedded, or here's where some expectation for the language use, and it becomes a little bit more natural as you get more practice, right? Okay, so that's one of the strands that we wanted to talk about. And what was the next one?
So we have, let me just go to my cheat sheet here, define and then modify. So when we talk about modify, the way that we're operationalizing or thinking about, okay, modify, what does that mean? Modify means to adapt curriculum or instruction. And so for this one, we think about complex text. Complex text is something that is very important and prominent in the new college and career readiness standards that have been adopted by many states, most states in the country. If they're not common standards, they may be state-based standards. Regardless, there are two areas that can be a bit more problematic for English learners within the new standards, and one of those is complex text. And so an activity that we recommend teachers might engage for ensuring students' accessibility to complex text is generating interaction between schemata and text. And so this is an activity where we would have a small group of students read a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs, an excerpt from a reading, and as they're reading or after they read, they each individually or independently write down key vocabulary or key phrases. Then they come together as a group and they go over those. And as a group, they write a summary sentence. And then they share the summary sentence with the large group or the teacher. And this provides them with a step-by-step scaffolded opportunity to sort of, again, break down the complexity that may be in terms of the types of text and the messages, the meaning of texts in such a way that they are working together and the language is more accessible.
Great. And this is an area maybe where there's even a little bit of opportunity for peer work in native languages, right? Maybe
Yes.
it's to talk about some ideas and some maybe discuss what is happening in the story or work together so that teachers can be bringing in students' native language in creative ways and helping kids make sure that they're really understanding.
Yes, absolutely. Right. This would be a perfect example of that.
Okay. Excellent. All right, so that's two. We've got our third our third strand.
Our third strand is Cultivate, and that's an excellent segue. Cultivate is where we recommend that teachers do everything they can to promote native language and literacy, maintenance, and development. And so I want to be clear there that we're not talking only about native language maintenance in terms of the oral language, but we are also providing opportunities whenever possible to think about literacy development and biliteracy development. And so I've talked about sort of a handful of examples with regard to promoting native language maintenance in the classroom. You just referenced one. Another would be allowing students to respond to a written task in their home language, interacting with peers in the home language, and then maybe reporting out in English, depending on capabilities in terms of language interpretation in the classroom. One thing that we want to be really careful about and clear about is and the teacher's level of language proficiency should not have an impact on the extent to which opportunities are provided for students to practice their native language. And again, here I think it comes back to this question of knowing our students. So we need to understand what are their language backgrounds, and we don't want to presume that we know this. So, for example, there are pockets of communities in various states in California and the Southwest where we have students who it may seem like their native language is Spanish, but in fact, their native language, their home language is an indigenous language. And so we don't want to sort of just presume or assume that students are bringing with them a particular language. And beyond that, when you ask this question of your students or your parents, they may think that you want the sort of upper level language. So we talk about, there are language that are upper languages and lower languages, and so we want to make sure that parents are comfortable and that we're sort of following through with these questions to make sure we get at all the various languages that might be represented by the family and in the family.
Our last Facebook Live event was about special education, and I shared a brief example which I think is worth repeating, in that a school in Baltimore, Wolf Street Academy, they noticed an uptick in their number of special education referrals. These were all students who spoke Spanish as their first language. They had been doing assessment in Spanish and they didn't quite understand what the issue was. When they dug a little further, they found that, in fact, all of these kids spoke Mixtec as their first language. And there was a stigma, as you said, and then so the parents had not identified it as a language that they spoke. And so the school, in addition to learning more about the language and learning how to support the kids, worked on a whole kind of campaign of embracing, supporting, giving opportunities. And the parents were reluctant. They didn't want to read anything out loud or speak out loud or sing a song at first, but the school kept working on it, and they kept trying to build the pride that the parents felt in the language at the same time they were working on the services. So very much a clear example of everything that you're saying in terms of the ways that this can kind of get in the way of figuring out what students are bringing with them. So that's great.
Yeah, and I would say that's interesting because what it sounds like to me is what we call intergenerational language loss potential there. So the parents aren't necessarily recognizing, or they're coming from a different perspective on the language other than the majority language or the language of wider communication. And there has been research on, and right now we're talking about a particular, students from a particular background, but as a general matter, intergenerational language loss among immigrants and U.S.-born non-English speakers. And it is occurring at the most rapid pace that it has in the history of our country right now. So one of the myths sort of that prevails is they don't want to learn the language. That's not true, and we have evidence of that. In fact, languages are being lost more quickly than they have before in this country.
There's so many talking points that come up. My grandmother learned English, and as an example of how people have this sense. And I think there's also been a lot of research done that shows that a lot of the early 20th century immigrant communities were very much living their full lives in their native languages, whether it's a German community in Wisconsin or wherever it is, and there were different sociopolitical, economic events that maybe had an impact on particular languages or particular countries, but I think there are a lot of myths that come out when the questions get political, as including this one that you're mentioning. And in fact, we know there's a dearth of ESL classes, particularly for adults, nationwide, right? And so that there are a lot of people who want to take ESL classes and actually don't have access to them, and funding may be cut or may be limited. And so it's a challenge to always find things that work with people's schedules, and that's why it's so great when a school can help provide that support to families and be working directly and meet their needs in a way that they can be there. Okay, all right, so we've gotten through our 3 strands. I think we've got one more to go.
Right, so this is apply. And here we return to this discussion of the college and career readiness standards. Argumentation is also prominent in college and career readiness standards, and it is something that can also be a challenge for English learners, because argumentation is involves a fairly specialized discourse patterns. And so what we have to do is we have to help break down for English learners and provide scaffolding for them around how to engage in argumentation. So that primarily means sentence stems, so that may, and also modeling. So we may be doing role playing and we're providing students with sentence stems. One way to start, before we get to the sentence stem piece of this, is to point out to students where they already are engaged in argumentation sort of socially in the classroom around whether it's academic content area stuff or social stuff. And so we might ask them and help them to sort of understand this is an argumentation skill. You're trying to prove that your whatever sports team is going to win, and the other one is not quite as great. And so it's identifying those, and then in the same way that we might do translation or interpretation, then giving them, here's the way that same argument would look, employing academic language. And this is the discourse pattern that's expected to convey that argument in the way that school expects you to. And so all of this also involves these notions of academic language, and related to that, even we could say the language of schooling, and what's expected in terms of how we communicate linguistically. So that's a piece, argumentation, that I think when we give these students opportunities to break down the complexity and teach them, and various folks have talked about teaching kids about linguistics and teaching them how to we talk about teaching strategies and learning strategies, giving students learning strategies around language and the language that they see in the curriculum and on standardized assessments and things of that nature. So.
And when we talk about academic language, we certainly, we're talking about the vocabulary piece, which is a little bit easier to pinpoint if you're in a science class. That your terms related to a particular experiment or a particular topic are going to be important, and that's a great place where cognates come in, which is also a resource I want to highlight for us, for our audience, that we have a list of cognates of English and Spanish, and that a lot of those content area words have cognates, and so when students are taught to recognize them, they realize they already kind of have those bases. But it's also a lot more. We have a friend of the project, Dr. Cindy Lundgren, who likes to talk about bricks and mortar, and I think that's a really helpful way to think about it, that the vocabulary words are the bricks, but a pile of bricks isn't a wall. So you need the mortar in there, which is it's maybe some of those transition words, or it's maybe the structure. The example, I can't quite remember what she is. It was something about birds and bats and wings, and even though bats are not birds, even though they have wings. So what is that even though implying, right? And sorry, Cindy, that was a little modeled, but you can be looking at the language that's used in your discipline, as well as some of the other kinds of language and function that students need to be able, as you said, to use the language of schooling to put a sentence together, an academic sentence together in their in their own assignments and activities, kind of being more independent. What are some other strategies that you like to recommend in terms of teaching academic language, particularly in content areas?
Right. Well, one thing to do, and this also is an example of native language maintenance, is have for kids glossaries or dictionaries So they can keep their own bilingual dictionary that may have examples of sentences, definitions, maybe synonyms, identifying roots, and if possible, images. And in terms of the academic language piece, I would say that we can think about the language of math, the language of the content areas, so the language of math, the language of science. And one example that comes to mind with math is plain. So plain, P-L-A-N-E. This, in common interactions, this does not really come up very often. The meaning of the word plane, which is essentially a surface in math. And so it's identifying that, I guess that's an example of a vocabulary, but also what is the sentence that I would see that word used in, and how do I recognize that sentence, and how do I then recast a sentence like that? So I think there are a lot of examples of how what we call academic language is so critically important in schools, and sort of the central role that all language involves, and not just vocabulary. So as you say, not just vocabulary. So that's sort of a segue back to academic language. But I think generally scaffolding for students, that may involve, we can think about curriculum versus instruction, and as I said, teaching strategies versus learning strategies. So in terms of curriculum, that might look like having a paragraph or a text that has been modified and adapted to make it more accessible for students. It may be providing sentence stems, as I mentioned earlier. It may be providing for students ample opportunities for interacting with various content in a way that is not reliant on language. And so that may involve, depending on the grade level, hands-on manipulatives. It may be using realia, which is not a picture of an orange, not a black and white picture of an orange, not a colored picture of an orange, not a plastic orange, but an orange that you can smell, you can taste. So that's when we talk about realia, it's like the real thing. I think really also what often happens with English learners in particular is losing meaningful learning and authentic interaction. We talk about interaction with peers, with a teacher, and interaction with a language, and interaction with the content. So it's a matter of identifying what are the various linguistic needs of students, and what role and function is language playing in our delivery of core content, and how can we ensure that core content is accessible for English learners without compromising English language development, and vice versa. So typically what will happen is the reverse. So I'm in my math class and I'm striving to understand the English and I'm losing the math. And so that's another common myth, which is that kids won't learn the language. They'll learn the English. They will learn the English. What's fundamentally important is that they don't get to 2 grades later and they've missed the foundational math. So that's really the linchpin of what we're doing.
And that's another place where collaboration can play an important role, where you can sit down with your ESL colleague, your bilingual colleague, and do some co-planning and be looking at some of these ideas and getting some ideas from that specialist of, let's look at this lesson. What do you see as some language challenges or background knowledge, or plain, P-L-A-N-E, we've got airplane, we've got P-L-A-I-N, and already with just that term, there are at least 2 potential confusing points in that single word, and math is particularly notorious for having multiple meaning words in word problems. And again, this idea that math is the universal language, but not if it's a written word problem where the student doesn't understand the operations, right? So that's a great place for collaboration as well, and getting to know everybody. I do have a question here. Christina wants to know, what are some ideas for differentiation, especially for newcomer ELLs?
Oh, that's a great question. So newcomer English learners, and I could back up and just say, again, getting back to this idea that English learners are not a monolithic group, and there are sort of subgroups within a subgroup, I call it, because there's my play on words, because English learners were a subgroup in No Child Left Behind. But newcomer students, I think, require a more specialized approach that accounts for a range of needs, not only those in the classroom, but my understanding is roughly 30% of newcomers are also students with limited or interrupted formal education. And so one thing we want to consider with the newcomers is, do these students have backgrounds that may involve other experiences like trauma? Might they be experiencing post-traumatic stress issues? And so again, first and foremost, we want to interface with the ESLs or eSchool specialists and determine what is the background of these students. Make sure this newcomer, determine whether or not this newcomer is a student with limited or interrupted formal education, comes from a refugee background, for example. So that's one piece. Socio-emotional is essentially what I'm saying. That we need to identify whether there are socio-emotional needs that we're not familiar with. And then from there, I think, we have to start very basic. And this is where, we talk about formative and summative assessment. So formative assessment, I think, plays a substantive role in working with newcomers and identifying where are they in terms of language proficiency and content learning background. And I think that needs to be a starting point, like how basic do we need to go? Many schools and, many districts will have newcomer centers, and so a student might go through a newcomer center and then come into the mainstream school. And so in that example, newcomers have already gotten some of that basic stuff. If there is not a newcomer center that's available, then the teachers have to start there with the basics, pencil, paper, those kinds of things. I think with newcomers in particular, we can leverage students' native languages. One of the things that comes into play with newcomers has to do also with grade level. So an important presumption to avoid is that the kids don't have prior schooling. So these kids may be gifted students, and that's something that I had thought about earlier when we were talking about various backgrounds of English learners, is we should certainly not discount gifted students who are also English learners. And so it may be that these students are far beyond even our mainstream monolingual native English speaking students in terms of content knowledge. And they may be advanced in their native language. So apart from the scaffolding and modifications and adaptations that we know for other students, those are the kinds of things we would want to take into account with newcomer students, I think. But beyond that, it's leveraging the resources available to you in terms of the specialists, individuals, and other available resources through Colorin, through Education Connections. We have a wide variety of resources available, and ensuring that there's a commitment to providing scaffolds that result in access to content, and not just sort of not being overwhelmed. So I think particularly with newcomers, there may be, it may be overwhelming to think about where do I start? I don't even know where to start. So I think one thing to keep in mind is there are many resources available for where to start. And then, once you get past some of those initial beginning points, then we want to begin employing some of the same general strategies and modifications that we do with other students. It's a matter of knowing what the strategy or modification is, whether it's gist or it's sentence stems, or it's using images or manipulatives. It's having that, we talk about a tool belt in your tool belt, and then using that however it is most responsiveness to a particular student in a particular context, in your particular classroom and content area, etc.
And you mentioned the tool belt and education connections. I know one tool you'd like to talk about is the lesson planning tool that you have as part. Could you just explain what that is and what people will find if they use that?
Right, so when we sat down to start thinking about, okay, well, how are we defining sheltering? A reasonable next step is, okay, lesson planning. And so what we've done is we've developed a lesson plan template, and this was for a previous project. I mentioned there are a handful of projects involved in the overall initiative. And for that, we hosted lesson planning competitions. And so we have populated lesson plan examples that we consider to be exemplars, also on our website. What we have, this is a template that is deliberately exhaustive, which is to say, and this is long, you should have seen the original version. We want to, at each point as we're planning, okay, what kinds of things do I need to be thinking about for English learners? And so right from the outset, what we ask, the first sort of section of the template asks, what is the program model? So most folks would know this, but what we're encouraging them to do is step back a little bit and think a little bit bigger picture and say, okay, well, what setting am I in? And then maybe they would think of, okay, well, Mrs. XYZ is down the hall and she's the ESL specialist. I must be in an ESL, a sheltering setting where there's an expert outside of the classroom. Maybe there's a paraprofessional inside the classroom. And how many students are English learners in your classroom? And what are the language proficiency levels of your students? Then from there, we ask that teachers write language objectives and related content objectives. Or the reverse, content objectives and related language objectives. And we want from the outset for teachers to talk about how they will be involving and integrating authentic texts and making connections to students' backgrounds. Students' personal backgrounds, and their academic backgrounds. And so that means delving into what is the level of prior schooling, what did prior schooling involve in terms of this content area. And then we talk about grouping. What types of groups will we put these kids in, and how are we asking students to use the various language domains? So we have a table, and we have the 4 language domains, and we ask teachers, where are you using listening, speaking, reading, and writing in this lesson? We hope that most lessons will hit all 4 language domains. So a common misstep with English learners is to neglect literacy, neglect reading and writing. And so we encourage teachers to use that table, again, like language objectives. Part of this is the exercise of requiring to fill out the table in and of itself then encourages some of this sort of reflection around, I hadn't thought about that. In terms of making connections with students' backgrounds, we ask in a portion of the lesson plan that teachers specifically identify how they're involving or inviting families in terms of not necessarily this lesson, but how does this lesson fit into an approach to family-school connections. So again, it's deliberately exhaustive. What we want is for teachers to sit down and sort of flesh out and distill where is language showing up that I don't realize it is.
Right. Right, and I think it's a big picture view, but it's kind of that then increases what you have in your tool belt to target your instruction and to make it culturally, linguistically responsive, and to build relationships with families, and then to start building on your successes and seeing what works. I wanted to mention the 2 books that you have worked on as well, because I know these are all areas that you have written about extensively. One is the 2nd edition of What Teachers Need to Know About Language, which is coming out, and you have a chapter coming out from Cal and Multilingual Matters. And the other topic, if I can find the title, perhaps The Handbook of Heritage, Community, and Native American Languages in the United States, Research, Policy, Educational Practice, and you had 2 chapters in there, right? Okay, so you, there's a lot more to hear from Sarah in these publications as well. And we're just about out of time. I wanted to know if there's anything else you wanted to add or any kind of closing thoughts as you're thinking about all of those teachers out there who really want to help and support their ELLs, but are still kind of thinking about, where do I start? How do I jump into this?
Well, I think what I would love to see is an approach to the field and to teacher preparation and in pre-service and in-service is thinking of teacher as educational linguists. That's one of the things that is one of sort of the approaches that's described in this book, What Teachers Need to Know About Language, is like considering a teacher to be an educational linguist. How do we make this person an educational linguist? So that I think is a good end game to go for, and I think the way that we do that is through the great work that's done by Colorin, Colorado, and you. And all the various resources that you request and the experts that you convene from whom you obtain these resources. And so, you know, it's a shared effort. I think, you know, what we're all aiming for is equity and access and leveraging the rich linguistic resources that students and families bring to schools.
That is a perfect way to end. Good. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Again, I'm Lydia Bryseth, manager of Colorin, Colorado. And we want to thank our partner, the National Education Association, who has made this series of Facebook Live events possible, as well as our longtime partner, the American Federation of Teachers, for all of their ongoing support of Colorin, Colorado. So thank you. Feel free to share and like this, this video, which will be archived on Facebook. It will also be archived on our website with a number of the resources that Sarah and I have discussed today as well, so that you can share it easily, particularly for your friends who aren't on Facebook. So thank you, and we will see you next time.